All right, we are at 83, so why don't we go ahead and get started?
Okay. Thank you all for being here. I am so excited to welcome you to Town Hall number 7 for the school year 2020-2021. Just a few short months ago, we kind of wondered if we would ever be here 3 weeks into the school year. So that is exactly where we are, and grateful for the folks that are going to be our panelists today. Couple of announcements. One is we are sitting at membership of 198 Vermont school nurses. I have been telling the rest of the executive committee, I know we can get to 200. So if you are not a member, I encourage you to join. If you are a member, please make sure that your registration or membership doesn't lapse. And once you join, you get to work with all of us. This is an amazing group of school nurses, and we all make each other better as we work together. Our collective experiences are what strengthen us. So that's my little spiel for that. And today, the executive committee is challenging Vermont state school nurses to get your flu shot. So I got mine today, and the folks were very delighted that I asked for a photograph, and they were very willing to participate. So I really appreciate that. And what was our, we're gonna have a hashtag. Clayton's gonna put it up there for you eventually, because I can't remember it even though we just talked about it. I also wanna share the words of Dr. Levine, who said not too long ago, a good time to get the flu shot would be any time in the rest of the month of September or during October. I would not want to have people wait beyond that this year. And he quickly followed that up with, this should be a year to err on the side of getting your flu shot earlier, not later. So that's our challenge to you, school nurses. Sorry, Clayton just shared that with me. Shared it with all of you. Hashtag VSSNA flu shots for school nurses. And we will continue to share that. And it'll be a fun way for us to advocate also for flu shots for our families and our students. So I know that we're all here because we want to hear from our panelists today. And they are COVID coordinators and school nurses from 3 areas around the state. And they've agreed to share their experiences dealing with positive COVID-19 cases in connections with their schools, as well as the planning and how that is working out now that we're actually in school. So we have Allison Conyers. She's the school nurse at Thatcher Brook Primary School in Waterford, and she's the COVID coordinator for the Harwood Union Unified School District. And Kathryn Saunders will be joining us. She's the school nurse at Crossett Brook Middle School in Duxbury. And Chantelle Safford is the school nurse at Echo Valley Community School District and the COVID coordinator for the Central Vermont Supervisory Union. And Mandy Mayer, school nurse at Meadowy Community School in West Pollitt and the COVID coordinator for Bennington Rutland School District. Reminder, put questions in the chat box. We're going to let our guests speak, and then we'll field questions. If you have a question for a particular one of our speakers, go ahead and put their name at the beginning of the question that you're putting in the chat box, and that will guide me to make sure that I address the right person to get that answer to your questions. So I think we are all set. Allison Conyers, we are anxious to hear about your experience and what we can learn from that as well. Thank you again for speaking to us.
Thank you, Soph. I actually am going to invite Kathryn to share her story first. Kathryn was the first call with her principal. Actually, our principal was the first call for the Department of Health on Sunday after the very first week of school to report that Crossett Brook Middle School had not one, but 2 positive cases on the very first day of school. So I'll let Kathryn kind of share her story with being called in with her principal and kind of how that initial phone call and response with the Department of Health went. You're muted, Kathryn. Thanks.
Okay, there we go. Thank you. So as Allison stated, Allison and I work together in the same school district, so she's well aware of this story. On Sunday, September 13th, our principal received a phone call from the VDH, but he didn't actually answer it. He found it as a message, and he said it was pretty relaxed message, like, we need to talk to you sometime, you know, about something about your school. So he decided to call back right away, and he found out that we had 2 positive cases in our school from the very first day. So he called me right away, and together, prior to calling me, the contact tracer who had contacted him wanted to speak to the school nurse and him, and so we called and had a conference call with him and the head of contact tracing. We got a lot of information, not necessarily about the individuals, but about what they wanted from us. And we were put to task right away. When we got off the phone call, we decided we had to get the superintendent and Allison in the loop with this, because they were totally unaware of what was going on. There's many things that we did, and I'd be happy to go over them, but I don't know if this is the time. But also, there's many things that we found out that we need to do. Even though we were doing really well with mitigation, they were so surprised and happy to hear what we had in process to mitigate transmission of the coronavirus. There were still things that we were going to put in place, but being the first day of school, we hadn't quite gotten that done yet. So, and I can go over those later. Okay. So once we called Allison and the superintendent, we had a 4-way meeting, and that's when I believe, Allison, correct me if I'm wrong, that's when the superintendent wanted to go to remote at that time. And she was even considering doing the high school, but we allayed her fears and told her not to do that with the high school, just to do it with the middle school if she was going to do it. So take it away, Allison.
Thanks, Kathryn. I think one of the things that we considered once we were talking about the number of students that were, the number of people in the building that were positive, there were 2, and 2 separate areas of the building, if you will. So it affected a considerable amount of more people than just having 1 person in the building. So the initial process of gathering all of the student names who were in the presence of the positive cases, all of the teachers' names who were in the presence of these 2 positive cases, ended up being quite a lengthy list. And what I learned from the process is that as the contact tracers do their job, your list might go from 40 students and 10 teachers to 20 students and 2 or 3 teachers. So we made a lot of decisions, I think, before that contact tracing, those phone calls happened. And I think had we known kind of how they were the questions they were going to ask and the way they were going to rule out certain people and rule in certain people, that may have helped us provide a different list in the future. And we may not have ended up having to close the entire building. You know, we were anticipating that there were going to be 14 teachers that were in the presence of these 2 cases. And that's why we ended up deciding to close the school. We didn't think we could staff the school that week and find 14 subs. But in the end, there were a lot less who were considered close contacts and who actually had to be tested for COVID. Some of the things, I don't know, Kathryn, if you want to share kind of how you guys gathered all your information. You know, there were 2 people on 2 teams. So at the middle school, our students and staff are separated into teams across the school. And so information was gathered for those. Now, some of those teams were also mixing with other teams for things like applied academics. So, you know, PE is pulling from a couple different areas. Whereas in an elementary school setting, you know, the kids are staying in their pods. So again, that reach ended up being, you know, larger, and then going back down after the contact tracers made their calls. The folks that tested positive were also bus riders. And so then we had to explore what were the mitigation strategies used on the bus? Who were all of the people on the bus? The bus carries in our district elementary school students, middle school students, and high school students. So one of the things I would do in the future is pull in that high school nurse as well a little quicker. We did have to end up watching bus video to find out where the students were seated on the bus. That was one of the questions that the contact tracer asked. They wanted to know who was in proximity to the people on the bus that were positive. So they wanted to know 2 seats in front of, 2 seats behind, and then the seats opposite those seats on the bus. So that took an extended period of time because we got a phone call on Sunday and we couldn't watch the bus video until Monday. And then that delayed even, you know, some more time for those families to be called to say, we believe that your child has been in the presence of someone with COVID. One of the things that we talked about was making sure that we give the teachers' names maybe initially. I think had we given the teachers and the Department of Health had started calling the teachers immediately for contact tracing, they would have been able to gather and share more information, and we would have been able to maybe lower that student contact list rather quickly so that we could make a more informed decision on whether or not to keep our schools open. We did have a lovely debriefing process with the Department of Health after the whole process. So a large group of people met with us and talked with us a little bit about how the process went, what things we might need, what things could support school nurses across the state. So I will say that I asked for a quick guide for students who've tested positive, and also students who were in close contact or close proximity with those who've tested positive, so that we can easily and quickly communicate with families. I know Kathryn can speak to hundreds of emails that came to her, and the superintendent as well received a significant amount of emails. So we kind of made some themes as to what parents and families were asking and shared that with the Department of Health. So hopefully some guided resources can be given to families right after that. Kathryn, do you want to share maybe some of the things we may have done differently or things that you wish we had had together on the first day of school?
Right. Okay. You briefly mentioned about the teachers. We had asked if the teachers could be contacted first, because that was, and that also whittled down the teacher list. It was almost like it was it was definitely a process. They admitted that this was the first school that they were working with, and so many people, and our needs are a little bit different than, let's say it was a gathering for a wedding or a family get together barbecue. I mean, we're talking about closing down a school or going remote. So we really had to have our information quickly and know what we were going to do based on the information they were giving us. So, you know, at first they took all the students that were in every class, and then they said, well, they weren't there long enough. But none of the kids were there long enough, or they were all practicing mitigation. So they were always 6 feet apart. They always had their masks on. They were outside because it was the first day was a really hot day. And so everybody was outside so much of the day. But they, I think they admitted subjectively would determine who they were calling and who they weren't. One of the things we didn't have in, even though we had asked for it, was the assigned seating arrangement. So they were, the teachers all had them, and the seats were all assigned. I mean, even before the first day of school, you could see everybody's name card was on their desk, and their things were all neatly stacked on their desk for the students, but yet they hadn't handed that in. That would have helped things go a lot smoother. Tom got the first call at 12:10 in the afternoon, and it wasn't until 5 in the evening that he was able to give them the final list of everyone that might have been in every classroom. And it wasn't a normal day because it was the first day of school. So children were not in their classes for the length of time that they normally would have been. So the exposure was more simply because they were trying out all their classes. But some classes were only 30 minutes long. Trying to think of what else. So the seating assignments were really imperative. The class schedule was really difficult to assess where children were going when and who was in those classes when it came to applied academics. Their core pods were great because the teachers moved in between the classes, but it was that other factor of them moving around that really made things a little bit difficult. We also didn't have the bus seating, but you looked at the video. So that was, and all these things are in place now, but they weren't because we had 2 days of school and, you know, we just didn't have those things. Allison, can you think of anything else we didn't have?
No, just some things that I was kind of thinking about moving forward. You know, we think a lot about where students are during the day, but if you could think about like the interventionists who work with your students, the special educators who are working with your students, a PT or OT, or folks that are coming in as contracted staff, you know, knowing where those folks are traveling throughout your school building is also imperative, especially if that contracted staff is the person who is the positive person. They've, you know, kind of been in different places. So establishing a system for maybe signing into classrooms, establishing a system for those folks to be screened, and you know where they're headed and who they're working with during the day, I think is really important too. That didn't affect our case, but I think those were things I was thinking of. What if it was this person? What would we do in that situation? So,
and Allison, you probably should discuss the communication that went out to families. We definitely were thinking we would change that a lot. Because
yes. So our,
yeah.
I will say that the communication, we actually used the lovely template sheet or the template letter that the Department of Health had, and our superintendent altered that very first paragraph. Kathryn and I made a suggestion that we say 2 persons within the school had tested positive, and our superintendent sent out a note saying 2 students and actually gave their grades, which the 2 of us had asked her not to do. That was challenging because I think that actually generated a lot more uncertainty from parents. You know, my child is in this particular grade. How come I haven't gotten a call? And I also think that when you put those 2 the grade levels in there, people start to kind of be able to say, oh, well, this family has these kids in this grade. And I just feel like that's way too much information and maybe not necessary. Our recommendation was to just say 2 persons within the school. And that communication went out very quickly. It was actually even before we gave that list of close contacts to the Department of Health. So I would say, you know, talk with your superintendent, with your administrators, kind of about how that communication process will initially go out and what you will do. What are they expecting? You know, I see from their standpoint, they're having to manage not only these positive cases, but all of the feedback that's going to come now from parents and families, where there's a line where if you give too much information, it can be harmful, but if you don't give enough, that can also backfire on you. So maybe even just having that discussion with your administrator on, you know, what can go out, what do they feel like is most appropriate in that situation, and you can have those conversations before it actually happens. I know every superintendent is different. Ours tends to be very make decisions very quickly. I'll just say that, without a significant amount of consideration for those.
And people were very concerned about how come they weren't contacted within 24 hours because they were watching the press conference. And if Mark Levine said everybody had been contacted within 24 hours and they're saying, no, that didn't happen. Well, sometimes they made a contact. They either emailed or left a phone message and no one called back. They did make the initial contact. but people were thinking they actually had to have a one-on-one conversation with them to consider that contact. We also realized that it didn't happen as quickly because the process of whittling down exactly who they wanted to speak to changed. And so I can't remember, Allison, were we going to put in the hours or not the hours, because that caused anxiety among parents as well?
We decided that if you would be notified by someone if you were in the presence of someone who was positive. So
Kathryn and Allison, thank you very much for being the initiates of our system. We're going to move now to Chantelle Safford to share a little of her experience or experiences.
Yeah, our experience is very similar to what happened with Kathy and Allison. We got the phone call on Saturday. It was midday, like 11 o'clock in the afternoon. I was actually on my motorcycle and saw the call come from my superintendent as I was riding my motorcycle out in where I had no cell service, so I couldn't answer the phone. I couldn't call her back, and it was hours before I could actually get a hold of her. And Karen Hart is on this call too, and she was actually on her way to a wedding. So we were all in the middle of our lives, and then just got this phone call that, hey, stop doing what you're doing. You need to respond to this. So luckily, our superintendent and the principal at the Williamstown High School got those calls, and they had the initial conversation with the health department, and they were able to kind of start the process. And then Karen and I were looped into those conversations with the health department the same way that Allison and Kathryn were, and to start our contact tracing. Where our story differs a little bit is that we spent so much time in our orientation and leading up to this saying that you have to limit your kids, you have to create pods, you have to keep them separate, you have to be able to contact trace. So they took that to heart and they listened, and it actually worked out best for us because it only impacted one grade level. And the language that we used with our communications to the public was a member of our learning community. So it didn't identify student, it didn't identify staff, it just identified that there was a member of our learning community that had tested positive. And if you were deemed a close contact, you will be contacted by the health department to follow their guidance. Since then, what we figured out that we would do differently is that the health department didn't really give us a script of what they were telling parents. So the parents kind of hear that shocking news that you've been in contact with someone, and then they stop listening. So then it circles back to the building nurse and to me, and that, you know, what did the health department tell you? And then they don't really know what they said. So we're trying to reinvent the wheel and say the same things. So I think if the health department would share that script of what they're telling parents would be helpful, just so that we're giving the same information, being consistent with the information they're giving. I think that we handled it well. It went great, and we're in the middle of it. Our isolation period ends on Saturday, and we're due to come back on Monday. The only reason the decision was made from our standpoint about closing the entire high school versus just the one grade, the health department's recommendation was to just stop the one grade, to isolate that one grade that it affected. But because we had a questionable student in another grade and a teacher who was also out sick, that we were still investigating her illness, whether it was COVID or not, and we had suggested she go get tested. We just erred on the side of caution that there could possibly be another area that was going to be impacted, and the best and safest way to proceed was to shut down the entire high school. And the 8th grade was included in that because the 8th grade and 9th grade had some crossover, and some of the cohorts had 8th and 9th grade students. So we ended up going remote for 8th grade through 12th grade and had our 6th and 7th grade in person last week because they were in a different area of the building and had no contact with any of those students from 8th grade to 12th grade. So Karen, have you have anything to say about what's happened since we got all those calls? And
no, just a lot of parent contact asking if they are going to be informed if the positive case was a member of their child's grade level, and reaching out to Chantelle and the principal and saying, okay, this is what I want to say, and this is what I want to consistently, you know, say to parents, that if you've heard or hear from the Department of Health, then that's when you not need to worry. But if you haven't heard from them, your child was not in that cohort, because there's only so much you can say and not say. And then we did have at least one student that crossed cohorts, which they were really trying not to do, but it was for a special ed class, and that wasn't determined until like Monday afternoon. So then that parent's calling me Tuesday saying, I was just told I had to go get tested at a pop-up site. I have no idea what that means. I don't, so it's very clear the parent was flustered on the phone, and then there was confusion in dates. So, some phone calls to the health department and just saying and asking parents, because I've been going through the past 3 days, just following up with parents and saying like, how's the student doing? How are they feeling? What was the conversation with the health department? Were you advised to quarantine, based on, your level of risk and exposure and, if you're considered to be within the contact. And so some parents were like, I think that I'm supposed to get tested or I'm supposed to quarantine, and it wasn't clear. And like Chantelle said, they may very well be hearing their child was exposed to a positive case at school and then not hear anything else. So again, just trying to make sure I'm putting out the correct information to parents and following up, and just that we're all communicating the same message so it's very clear, because not every student did get a COVID test, but just so parents understood that they still needed to continue to quarantine until Saturday. And I know there was confusion in dates for one of my parents and families. So it's just been a lot of phone calls, a lot of communication and clarification on all end. And yeah, it's definitely a learning process. And we're just didn't think it would happen so soon, I guess.
I guess the lessons we learned is that the phone call can come at any time, and just have, the other part that was complicating is that the health department sends out encrypted emails, and those encrypted emails can't be opened from your phone or a tablet or another device. You have to have a desktop to be able to sign into those emails. So if you have your home laptop from school or a desktop computer at home so that you can access those messages, that was a challenge for me because I was not home when I got all these messages and emails, and I couldn't open anything from my phone. So it had to wait until I could get to a computer at home so that I could process and figure out what was going on. And then Sunday morning, we were looped into the conversation with the health department, Karen, myself, the principal, and the superintendent. And we had a conversation about what's the best steps forward, about the recommendation that they recommended we just isolate the 11th grade. And then we had the conversation about the possible cross with another student and another staff member who was out sick and erring on the side of caution. And the health department agreed with our erring on the side of caution. And we asked the health department to provide us with a statement that we could put out to our families. So that was helpful, that we could actually note them in our communication to families about what the recommendation was from them, so that apparently all of our community and families knew that that was part of the conversations, that their guidance is what's driving what we're doing now. Otherwise, and then the other thing, since then, we aren't quite had our debrief yet, so we haven't been able to talk to the health department about what worked and what we wish we'd had earlier on. I think that will come next week once we get through this weekend, and hopefully nothing else pops up. As of now, I don't know of any of the students in that cohort who've become symptomatic, so hopefully we've done everything right with our mitigating factors, and moving forward with this will be a successful run of our first one, because we know there'll be more. So we're just preparing ahead and helping families feel comfortable that we can handle it. We've got it, and we've done everything right, and that we can move forward. If it happens again, we'll do the same process again. Moving into like from phase 2 to phase 3, our school district, I've talked to the superintendent and our teams like all week this week talking about what that means. For us, it doesn't mean anything. We have our practices in place, and we've determined that what we're doing is working, and moving into using gymnasiums and cafeterias is not something we need to do, because the process we have in place is working. Kids are eating in the classrooms, and it's up and running, and we've only been at it for 3 weeks. So we're going to use the state's term. We're going to open very slowly, 1/4 of a turn at a time, and we'll address it as we need to. And as it gets colder and our gym classes can't be outside, we'll address that and do it the safest way possible in the school. And those are the other things that are part of the phase 3 opening, was the sports schedules, and that'll be the athletic departments and the superintendents will be handling that, and we'll all just kind of weigh in on what we think is best and safest.
Chantelle and Allison and Kathryn, thank you so much. Mandy's here as well to answer some questions. So let me go to the first one. Were the tracers, so this would be a question to those of you who actually had the positive cases. Were the tracers focusing on just the people who had 15 minutes or more contact with the particular students?
I'll start. So that they initially, we knew that that was what's the definition of close contact, 15 minutes or more, less than 6 feet. And none of our children, we felt, met that criteria. So they changed the definition of what would be close contact. And that's what made it difficult for us to really pin down what students. They finally made a determination if it was more than 5 hours in one classroom. But that took a while for them to get to that, at least at Crossett Brook.
Yeah, I think that came from the questions that they were asking the teachers and the students at the beginning of the contact tracing calls. When we had our wrap up with the Department of Health last Friday, one of the contact tracers shared with us that they kind of were looking at that close contact or within the same classroom for greater than 5 hours. What was interesting to me was that they were wondering, they did mention masks or no masks. You know, all of our students are wearing masks, our teachers are wearing masks, but when they're contact tracing, they're not considering the mask wearing. They were really focusing on the exposure over the length of time for those students and to that staff. So I think while our mitigation strategies are great, it wasn't like, you know, there's these 20 kids were exposed to these other students without a mask on. They really used that time frame of what they said was 5 hours eventually. But I think that came from the conversations that they had with everyone. And I feel like we had a wonderful debrief with the Department of Health and shared kind of our ideas, things that we felt like could maybe have been done differently, some things that worked really, really well, and some challenges that we had. So I appreciated that follow-up and that closure. And we have passed our 14-day quarantine period, and we have had no additional positive cases associated with these 2 members of our community. So we gave kudos to the school community and all their mitigation strategies yesterday. So.
Thank you. That's great. Chantelle, do you have anything that you want to add? I saw you were nodding your head. So
I think that we're all in the same place, and it was like the contact tracing questions. We weren't privy to what they were saying to families, so we couldn't really help determine, and we haven't had our debrief yet, so it all seems logical. One of the other questions someone asked is, how do we define notifying our staff? So that was a contentious little point that we had, because we have 6 schools in our district, and it only affected 1 of the 6 schools. And we didn't feel like the superintendent needed to notify every school in this CVSU district that we were going to close Williamstown because there was a positive case, because it didn't affect anyone in the other buildings. Well, every teacher in the other buildings got really haired up because we didn't notify the entire CVSU district that one of our schools was going to close because of a positive case. And I tried to relay to them that it didn't affect you, and just because you want to know doesn't mean you get to know. It's information that is only needed to be put out to people who need to know, and the people who need to know have dealt with it and moved on. So just because you want to know doesn't mean that every single school district is going to be notified of every school. If it's in your building or in your class, you will be notified. If it doesn't affect you, you're not going to be in that conversation. So it's just like everything else that we do. I think people have a lot of fear and panic around everything, and they're not really thinking clearly. They all, what about me? And I think the other part that I've noticed from the first 3 weeks of school is that we are assuming that every person in this building is sick. Every person in your school has COVID and is sick, and because we're having mitigation practices and everyone's wearing a mask, we all have that assumption that we're all sick and everybody's potentially going to infect us, when in reality, our health screenings and everything that we're doing is helping to keep the healthy people here and our sick kids out. So if they can just change their thinking to be more proactive and positive that everyone who's here is healthy and we're all doing the best we can to stay safe.
Thank you, Chantelle. It's pretty exciting. Karen Nelson says, wonderful feedback from our nurses. She is one of the school nurse liaisons, as you all know. And I just am real appreciative of hearing what worked for the system that we had talked about setting up and how it has, how it's opened up some different ideas, and the feedback that those of you who got to experience it are able to share with us. And that's so valuable, truly. So there's another question that says, a little bit off topic. We have SAT testing this Saturday and have people signing up from many other states. When we contacted them to let them know they couldn't come due to their rates, they asked if they could get a negative COVID test and then come. Sharonlee, I'm wondering if that's a question you could answer or help us walk through.
I'm going to ask you to say that again. I was just getting a communication from another meeting that I have just missed.
Okay.
So go ahead.
We have SAT testing this Saturday and have people signing up from many other states. When we contacted them to let them know they could not come due to the rates, they asked if they could get a negative COVID test and then come.
So that's a great question. We have been working on SAT issues, but I need to go look at the FAQ and see if we got some more guidance. So I think thank you, Megan, and I think you've done a nice job following up with the correct information, but let's confirm that. It doesn't make sense to go ahead and get, quarantine and then test unless somebody's going to keep track of all that. And that's a lot to ask for the school. I'll get back to you.
Thank you. Lots of questions about quarantining and kids and staff, going out of state, funerals, weddings, and shopping. Also, can I go to my dad? I haven't seen him in a long time. That sounds like it might be another VDH question. Not much related to what's going on in the schools themselves.
So I did see that, Claire. The funeral is a good question. We need to work that one out. I can tell you my personal thought is I'm thinking of the airline, if it's an immediate family member, that qualifies you for the flight discount, but not if it's your grandmother, for example. But I don't have a good answer for you, so don't pay attention to my wanderings. We'll get you a better answer for things like funerals. But otherwise, other things are considered leisure travel, and so they would have to quarantine.
I did think, Soph, that someone put the link to the ACCD guidance for cross-state travel. That's something that we actually have open at our school every single day because a lot of these questions come through. We had even one today about a student who was traveling to Massachusetts for medical appointments, which is exempt from the quarantining. So that's a really great resource to be able to answer some of those questions.
Yes, I'd like to reiterate that because we also have questions about what do the contractors do if they need to work on the ventilation systems that are in our buildings that are not up to snuff. And we have to look at more than just the guidelines for school. And I think that's important.
One thing I was going to mention too is the on the ACCD page, the map that talks about travel in the counties, and it might also be on the Department of Health page, but that's updated on Tuesdays now instead of Fridays. So that's a change. This week was the first week with that updated on a Tuesday, which should make some differences of when people travel, because when it's green versus when it changes to yellow or red. but people need to be able, you need to understand leisure travel versus essential travel. Those nuances are really super important, like Soph said. But the big piece was changing from a Friday to a Tuesday. And some folks might not know that. And that's posted on the website, but I just wanted to call that out too.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. I think that was a wise decision at the state level. So people can plan trips if they're making any for the weekend where they want to go. So check out all those links because you have nothing else to do, I know, and all the time in the world to keep looking at all the links and following the updates because we sure get a lot of them, don't we?
So if I just wanted to put in a plug for the desktop model that we did, the state sent out, I would highly encourage, I watched that 2 days before we got our positive case, and it was very helpful for me to know and be prepared. I had made our contact tracing list and our logs 2 days before that and sent it to all of our nurses so that when and if it happened, we would be ready, and all we had to do was input the information. Luckily, I got that information ahead of time, but that whole scenario was very helpful. I highly recommend it for the administrators and the nurses, but I also recommended it to our teachers so they knew what happens behind the scenes, so they can be a part of the process and know what we're going to ask of them if that call comes. So it's been very helpful, and the people that have watched it have felt value in it, and it's been very helpful to people.
Chantelle, that's great feedback. That we will all of the public health department people that are on now will be joining that and leading it. So you'll see a few familiar faces and some expert epidemiologists.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's great.
Chantelle, somebody put in the chat box, can you share that resource again? I didn't hear what you had said. So if you could share what you just mentioned.
The school nurse liaisons, Karen Nelson actually sent it to us. It was a link to the desktop model, and it's on, I can find it on the website and share it. But it was sent out as a link of it was like an hour and 15-minute training. Sharonlee, maybe you can speak to that or put the link in.
It was in Sharonlee's messages 2 weeks in a row, and it is on the website also.
Yeah.
I know that that's on the VDH page for under school professionals, for school nurses.
I'm putting it in the chat right now.
Thank you.
And so if I could, so one of the questions that was sent to the COVID-19 email address, and it was that they couldn't find this topic in the guidance, but if a child has a fever and is showing symptoms of COVID, can the sibling attend school if they're asymptomatic? And so just wanted to get that out there. If someone could share an answer to that. Sharonlee, I don't know if you have that at your fingertips.
Yep, so that's part of the algorithm as well. But unless somebody has symptoms, they should be able to attend school. So if you have a family member who is being tested for COVID, assuming there's no known contact or risky travel by the siblings, they can attend. The testing person stays home, others can attend.
Sharonlee, that question came up a lot when we were having to quarantine quarantine students, with siblings in different schools, and we got a lot of phone calls. Well, my brother was, quarantined based on this case at Crossett Brook. Do I need to stay home from school as well? Or we had a teacher who's actually their daycare said, because you were a teacher at Crossett Brook, you can't send your kid to daycare. Yeah. So that was some of the feedback we actually gave to the Department of Health as well, to maybe talk to the daycares about that situation. But making sure that families know that unless you're the direct contact, then you're okay to be at, coming to school, going to work, etc.
The other
and
thing
that's a question we've been addressing with the child care providers for 6 months. So it takes a long time. Chantelle expresses it really, really well. Fear is a big part of being able to interpret information.
We also had to clarify a lot what the difference between isolation and quarantine was. So being clear with the definitions of isolation is we know you're sick, or quarantine is we think you might be exposed, and isolation is when you're sick. So making sure that we had those, I might have that wrong because I've said it so many times, but either or, like clarifying those definitions for families of what is what isolation means and what quarantine means. And we put those definitions in our communication too, so that it was clear to them what we're asking you to do when we say isolate or quarantine.
One other thing I would just mention that we had with some of the kids that had symptoms and were directed to get testing, their siblings stayed home. And it wasn't, we didn't ask them to stay home, but the parents felt it was their obligation to protect the community for their children to stay home. And we didn't fight that because we respected that decision. But it was a conversation. What the good part was, it was a conversation between the parent and the school nurse about what the different aspects were of that.
We had that here too, and some parents just felt safer and they said, I'm not sending. So they had a student in the cohort that was waiting on test results, and then that sibling was in 6th or 7th grade. And one parent said, I just don't feel comfortable sending my child to school, when I'd emailed Dr. Holmes and just said, this is what I understand now. Can you just really clarify if a student's getting tested, can the sibling still, as long as they're not symptomatic, be at school? And she said, yes, that is currently what is allowed. But I had many parents that were like, no, I don't feel comfortable, and because heaven forbid that test comes back positive and then I've just sent a sibling to school. And I said, that is fine by me. Like, better to be safe.
Our community's been really good about erring on the side of caution and keeping kids home abundantly. Like, my kid has a runny nose, I'm going to keep them home for a couple days. We have a parent who is getting tested, has bronchitis, and is getting tested, and they decided to keep their 2 kids home who have absolutely no symptoms, and they're confident that this test is going to be negative, but don't want to be the ones that are going to be the stigma of being the positive case that shuts down your school is really a motivating factor for a lot of these families. They're choosing to stay home and not come to school, which is every school nurse's dream.
So if I do have another question from the COVID-19 email address, if that's okay to share.
Absolutely.
Okay, so this one is, I have a few cases, I have a few classes with a student not wearing a facial covering. The teacher wants to send a letter home to families letting them know that there is a student not wearing a mask. The 6 feet is always maintained. I think that a letter raises a confidentiality issue. What do you think? Sharonlee?
Yes, and also gets in a little bit of, touches a little on harassment or bullying. I'd really check that with your administration. That needs to be a team effort on the COVID coordinator with the school administration.
So when I read that question though, I was just wondering, this is me just wondering out loud, but one, not wearing a facial covering in school inside the building is not what the guidance says. And there's been a lot of talk back and forth recently in the last couple of weeks about exemptions for wet masks, which are not really being written that often. So is it, if a student's in a classroom, even though they're keeping 6 feet without a facial covering, aren't there other things that need to be in place, like protections with some type of barrier and other stuff that would then be helpful?
So those are part of the team's conversation with the teacher and the COVID coordination team or the leadership of that building. If you have a student who really can't wear a mask, that's part of the, I would anticipate that would be more likely due to something related to possibly an IEP accommodation. But that's really a team decision as to how to make sure the teacher feels safe and that the other students feel safe. There have been lots of questions, and we understand that that's a real challenge for you. At the same time, there are situations where there's a limited number, but there are situations where it's a team decision with the medical provider when you have a student who truly cannot wear a face cover, or who's lots of saliva, or who's spitting, or who has some other reasons for truly being unable to wear a mask. And providers are working with schools and families on this.
Great, thank you. And then another question that was also in that was, The Strong and Healthy Start document on page 19 states students must be kept in groups not to exceed the maximum number allowed by state guidance, including teachers and staff. And Sharonlee, I know we've talked about this, and there's two places you have to look: the executive order as well as the ACCD guidance, because there's an indoor and outdoor requirement, plus some towns might have something that's different too. Is that all true?
The towns could, but typically they're following the executive order. The cohorting is one of our least favorite questions. And I think it was intentionally left out of the guidance because it really depends on the situation. Ideally, 25 is still a cohort number. That's wonderful. But now that we're into step 3, it's more flexible. If you're looking for event functions, that's really for large groups, the 75 to 150 depending, and there's a square footage per person for events. You can have multiple events in a very large venue as long as the cohorts of those groups are separate. But that's not really the classroom, related to classroom stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sharonlee. Mandy, I'm wondering if this might be a good opportunity for you, having listened to the experiences of the COVID coordinators who have received positive calls. Is there anything that comes up in your mind related to your planning or how things are set up in your school district? Some of the questions perhaps that you've been fielding from families and staff and administration. Anything come up that might be helpful for the rest of us? And actually anything is helpful for the rest of us.
This conversation has been so incredibly invaluable for me, sitting here listening to these nurses who've gone through it. And I keep thinking about this entire summer and how those of us who were care or nurse coordinators spent a lot of time behind our computers, writing documents, fixing documents, giving advice to principals and superintendents, but to have to put it into practice is a whole different ballgame. So to have these particular stories is really helpful. I think having the mindset of a health professional when you are at the table with all your principals and the superintendent has been really helpful for them. And I know that really there's sort of a new understanding of what the school nurse role is and how important that is in general in the school setting. So what I've said to our superintendent just today is that the most important thing for us as school nurses in our district is that we are all communicating and giving families the same information, because I think the community will trust your district more if they're hearing the same message from everybody. And we're so fortunate in our district to have that communication between the school nurses. So that's one thing that has really come to the surface for me, because in the past we haven't really communicated that often. So as we're going forward, I think our plans will be more unified as a district.
That's great. Thank you very much. We have just about 5 more minutes. I always have a hard time scrolling back and forth in the chat box to find questions, in case you're wondering what part of my struggle is.
One of the questions that just popped up was, are kitchen staff required to wear facial coverings while preparing food?
Yes,
Thank you.
without question.
I think part of that, as a reminder, sometimes people say, show me where it says that. Well, it says all people inside the school building will wear cloth facial coverings. So sometimes I struggle with people who I feel like they just want to be argumentative, and it's exhausting, is it not, to get all the questions over and over. And I know in our executive committee, I'm going to share this fun thing with you. So we don't know the guidance inside and out, but Clayton sure knows it pretty well. So even us as executive committee will ask him a question. And what is his response usually, Becca?
Read the guidance. Read the guidance.
But I don't yell
Page
it.
4.
So we've been joking about having a t-shirt made for him. You got a question, and on the front and the back is read the guidance. The answers are there. Sometimes it's easier to not look, and I'm not saying don't ask the questions. I'm just encouraging you to take the power that you have as the professional that you are and answer with the knowledge and the security that you are interpreting the guidance correctly. If you're not sure, another opportunity to do what Mandy has talked about, get your school nurses in the district together so you're talking the same message and you're supporting each other as well as your school community, both inside the school and outside of the school.
And if I could just add to the school nurse liaisons are also someone that they can reach out to because they have direct access to back to the Department of Health, obviously. And so they're a wealth of information too. So there's several different ways. And, we jokingly say read the guidance. It's really important because some of it is trying to figure out exactly what it's saying, because some of it's left a little bit nebulous so that you can make some of those decisions on your own. And Sharonlee says it very often is we need to use our nursing judgment in many cases and to come to a decision. And then we do some things with consensus, and sometimes we have to ask them subject matter experts for a real bottom line. Why is it 100.4 degrees? Or why, when it's cold outside, does an IR thermometer not work on foreheads? I mean, those types of things. And I just wanted to point out, someone had asked a question about plexiglass in the chat box. And if everyone wants to go to that, Nathaniel was able to share in the Fact One guidance for the guidance about plexiglass, and Sharonlee also made a comment on that. So there's some things in the chat box. We're going to grab all of that and put it into our FAQ that goes out after this. But I just wanted you to know that there are some things, there's links in there that if you click on those, you can have those opened up for you too.
And again, I want to thank all of you and those of you who have spoken and shared your experience with us, as well as those who've put questions in the chat box and have sent questions to COVID-19, and the experts that are answering the questions. And I really do appreciate the connectedness with the Department of Health through our school nurse liaisons, even more than ever in the last month and a half leading up to opening schools and since we've had school open. And I look forward to learning more from all of you. So thank you, our speakers, as well as those of you in attendance. And I know that many of you will be watching this recording and eagerly writing questions, because one question leads to 5 more, doesn't it sometimes?
And I just looked on the VSSNA website and we're still at 198.
Oh, come on, you guys.
Just one last pitch for that, but we'd love to have everybody joining. It really helps us do things like this. And the more members we have, the more of these types of events that we can hold.
Thank you all. Have a fabulous week.